Thank you, Gary Best. Continuing now with Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thank you for calling in.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be here, even on a gray day.
Dr. Ostrower, I'm guessing you heard the last segment there with Congressman Tom Reed. Sounds like he and a lot of people are working a lot of hours these days because of this COVID-19 crisis.
Well, I think in a crisis, and it really is a crisis, we've not seen anything like this since 1918. That's what happens. I think that a lot of people are pitching in, and one hopes that it's not going to be particularly partisan. I think that Tom Reed, if I can offer a general comment about him, I've known him for a long, long time. He's one of the more bipartisan congressmen or congressmen or congresswomen in the entire House of Representatives, and I think that we should be grateful for that. By the same token, I think that he works with quite a number of Democrats who are also very bipartisan on the Problem Solvers Caucus. I think that they've done a lot of good work, but unfortunately, it tends to be a little bit under the radar. Most of what we're watching tends to come from the White House. It tends to come from the president's evening briefings, at least over the after the last few weeks or so. And I just wish that the President of the United States was 1/4 as bipartisan as Congressman Reed. I think that what the President has done over the past few months, really in some ways, going all the way back to the beginning of his presidency, he is one of the most divisive presidents I think that we have ever had, and that's not what we need at a time of national crisis. One should also note that this crisis is going to be with us for a long, long time. I mean, we may open up here in upstate New York. Some other states, such as Texas, are opening up right now. That may not be the best thing to do immediately, and until we have a vaccine, until we have a means of, essentially protecting the over 60% of the public from COVID-19, we may be in some difficulty, and that means that airlines, people may not fly on airlines, they may not stay in hotels. Are we going to see, for instance, the bankruptcy of some of the large hotel chains, such as the Hilton chain and so forth? One certainly hopes not, but you can't rule it out any longer. And in that sense, what has begun as a medical crisis, as a health crisis, has clearly morphed into an economic crisis. And as I said a moment ago, this is not going to disappear by September, unfortunately.
Yes, it'll be very interesting to see how the economic development and the reopening after the shutdowns go. On the topic of members of the House, we should do a show sometime, Dr. Ostrower, on the different members of the House who have represented this region. I got looking in a Google search earlier this morning about, who used to be in Congress and representing the southern tier in western New York over the years. And I mean way before Congressman Houghton or Congressman Randy Cool, I mean like 100 years ago. Would you be open for doing a show sometime on that topic?
I'm not sure I know who was around 100 years ago. I will say that there was a congressman with Tom Reed's name almost. His name was Dan Reed, and at one point he was the longest serving member of Congress in the entire House of Representatives. He served this district until approximately, I'm going to guess, around 1965 or so, maybe a little bit later than that. He was a Republican. And then he was succeeded by a fellow named Hastings, who unfortunately he was a Republican. I don't know exactly where he came from, but he was connected to and then finally indicted for financial corruption. So he had to resign, and then he was followed by the mayor of Jamestown. Stan Lundeen was his name. Some of you may remember the name of Stan
Yes.
Lundeen. Lundeen was a Democrat. He was the only Democrat that I can remember who has represented this area in years and years. and then finally he went from serving our district to becoming the lieutenant governor of New York State.
Right.
And then he was then, in turn, followed by a number of other Republicans, including, of course, Tom Reed right now. So,
he was frequently on the show back in the 70s, wasn't he, Gary?
History, of course, but who served this district before Dan Reed, in contrast to Tom Reed? I don't have a clue. I just don't know the answer to that.
Stan Lundeen used to be on the station and this show quite a bit, didn't he?
Yes, he was. Again, back during the 1970s, he was very, very. As I said, he was the mayor of Jamestown. He was very, very good in respect to local connections, and so he was indeed on WLEA. He often visited the district. He was an outstanding member of Congress. And I was a little surprised that he was reelected a number of times, precisely because he was a Democrat in a very Republican district. But as I say, he was he was often here. He was very visible, and he was very approachable.
Dr. Gary Ostrower, as long as we're engaging in the topic of history this early in the show, you wanted to talk about the 1932 election of President Roosevelt? Well,
President Roosevelt is right. I did want to say something about that, and I think that one might want to compare the president that we elected in 1932 to the president that we elected in 2016. One of the points that I have made rather publicly, including in an op-ed that appeared in the Hornell, in the Evening Tribune and the Spectator a few weeks ago, was that crises often bring out the best in us, or maybe under certain circumstances, the worst in us. A lot of pressure there. We find, for instance, if I can just go back a little bit before 1932, Abraham Lincoln was not considered. Most people didn't know who he was in 1858 or 1859 outside of his own state of Illinois. He got the nomination after a very, very contested primary. Well, it wasn't really a primary, but a contest, if you will, in the Republican Party in 1860. But many people didn't expect very much from him. When he became president, a number of southern states left the Union almost immediately, and when he was inaugurated president, that is on March 4th of 1861, within 3 weeks, knowing that there was a possible civil war on the horizon, his Secretary of State from New York State, I might add, William Seward, who was one of his rivals in 1860, William Seward suggested that Seward, become the effective president. That, in other words, that Lincoln essentially cede his powers to Seward. That's because Seward really didn't have much respect for Lincoln, didn't expect much from Lincoln, and I think that Seward spoke for quite a number of other people as well. And yet we all know that Lincoln not only rose to the occasion, but is generally considered by historians to be one of the very, very best presidents that we've ever had. And if you ask me, I would say he is number one on that list. If you read his Gettysburg Address, it is a ringing, beautiful document. A government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And if you read that Gettysburg Address, you're going to find that not once does he use the first-person singular pronoun. Not once does he talk about I. He talks about we, okay? But he never talks about himself. And then other presidents, too, have kind of risen to the occasion. An example would be Woodrow Wilson, who was a president of a university. He then became the governor of New Jersey. And when he became president, again, not a huge amount was expected of him, but he became a member, if you will, of that progressive, what they called back in that period, the Progressive Coalition. And during his administration, some very, very important pieces of legislation were passed, not the least of which was the establishment of the Federal Reserve System, which has given a good deal of stability to our financial programs here in the United States. When FDR ran in 1932, he had been the governor of New York State. This is kind of interesting. In 1928, Al Smith, who was the governor of New York, Al Smith ran for president, and he didn't do very well. He only won the electoral votes of about 8 states out of the 48 at that time. But Al Smith he kind of, handpicked FDR to be his successor as governor of New York State. And so Roosevelt, as governor of New York, turned out to be a dynamo. He electrified much of upstate New York through the St. Lawrence, Valley, Power Commission. He was, probably the most vigorous, the most activist, and maybe the most successful governor in the entire country once the Depression began in 1929, in October of 1929. And yet, when he ran for president in 1932, the most well-known columnist in the United States, his name was Walter Lippmann. He was very, very well known and very highly respected. And Walter Lippmann said in January of 1932, as it became clear that FDR would seek the Democratic nomination for president in that presidential election year, and there were about 7 or 8 other Democrats who were seeking the nomination as well. And Walter Lippmann said of FDR that he's a very nice man who, without any particular qualifications for the job, would like to be president. Well, boy, you talk about underestimating someone. I mean, FDR becomes president, and along with Lincoln and along with Washington, becomes one of the 3 greatest presidents in American history. So, could we have anticipated that kind of, presidency? And the answer is no, we certainly could not. And yet FDR was there when we needed him. And when he was inaugurated in 1932, and I shouldn't say that, in 1933, on March 4th of 1933, he was elected in 32, but the inauguration did not come until March back in that period. And he said very, very famously, and he said a lot of things in his inaugural address, but he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And in 1933, the Depression was at its worst. It was at what we call its nadir. There were approximately 25% of all Americans who had been employed in 1929 were out of work by 1933, and another 15 to 20% of the public was underemployed. And by underemployed, I mean they were working part-time, not full-time. And yet, FDR injected a degree of confidence in the American public. He shored up their sense of optimism by saying exactly what he did. And, one might argue, Brian, that he was wrong. There were a lot of things to worry about. There were many things to fear in 1923. When he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, let's remember, Hitler, who had just become chancellor just about 5 weeks earlier, had become chancellor of Nazi Germany. The European peace was beginning to break down. The Russians were under, at that time, Joseph Stalin, who was every bit as much of a totalitarian dictator as Hitler would turn out to be. We were facing the greatest economic catastrophe in all of American history until that time. And yet, somehow or another, what we remember from that address was not what FDR said about his program, which he was going to call the New Deal. It was the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And that's what we needed. I just wish, and I'll bet you a lot of people listening to this program right now just wish that we had a president right now who can inject the same kind of confidence, who could speak to all Americans instead of simply members of his own base.
You spoke about Roosevelt, FDR there, as a candidate for governor, electrifying New York State politics. That's kind of interesting because this was 1928, I believe, Dr. Ostrower, very early in the radio period, and he must have relied on public appearances and a newspaper largely in 1928, though I believe there was a little radio news in 1928. But Roosevelt very quickly picked up on the importance of radio as president. Wondering, Dr. Ostrower, before the electronic media, how would a candidate electrify? Public appearances and lots of newspaper interviews? Would that be how they would capture the imagination?
For many, many years, presidents did not campaign in the way in which they campaign today. or even for that matter, in much of the 20th century. During the 19th century, for instance, a president would usually remain at home, and reporters, and occasionally groups of people, but reporters would show up at his home. And so those presidents, whether we're talking about Grant, or we're talking about Rutherford B. Hayes, or William McKinley, they would sit on their front porch. I mean, and it was quite literally described as their front porch. And at that point, the reporters would show up, and they would offer the president or the president-to-be would offer interviews. Both candidates would offer interviews and so forth, but they didn't They did not campaign around the country. That is a 20th century phenomenon. Now, for Roosevelt, yes, you're correct, I think, in saying that we had radio. Radio really comes into its own in the early 1920s. By 1928, many Americans had radios. But I also want to remind you that when Roosevelt ran for the position as governor of New York State in 1928, and in that year, I might add, Herbert Hoover, the Republican, is going to win the presidency big by, it wasn't even a close election, and yet surprisingly, Roosevelt won the election for governor as a Democrat here in New York State. But Roosevelt could not broadcast by radio into much of the state, and that's because we did not have electricity in this part of the state. The entire southern tier was without electricity. It would be FDR who would bring electricity to this to this area, but only after he was governor. I mean, that was one of his great accomplishments. And I think that kind of accomplishment is one of the things that's going to make him much more saleable, so to speak, much more attractive to the Democratic Party in 1932 when he sought the presidency. The other point I would make, and again, I think you're kind of alluding to this, is that no one used radio more effectively than did FDR once he became president. Most people here will remember the term from their high school history courses, the fireside chats. Roosevelt would have these fireside chats once every week or once every 2 weeks, and families would gather together in front of their radios, and they would listen to the president. And it was as if the president was talking to them almost in an individual way. Think about the difference during the 1930s. You had two national leaders who were extremely popular and extremely effective. One was Adolf Hitler in Germany, and the other, of course, was FDR here in the United States. They became leaders of their country, as I said before, within 5 weeks of each other. Hitler would communicate through these mass rallies, and they would also be broadcast. But these huge rallies, most of them held in either Berlin or in Nuremberg, which is in the southern part of Germany. Nuremberg was kind of the headquarters of the Nazi Party, and you have these huge rallies with maybe 300,000 or 400,000 soldiers there, with these huge Nazi banners flying around. And when I say 300,000, 400,000 soldiers, also maybe 500,000 or 600,000 citizens. So these were rallies that contained perhaps 1 million people. And of course, there was martial music. There was a great deal of cheering and of chanting and whatnot. It was Hitler communicating through these huge assemblages of people. Roosevelt did exactly the opposite. When he communicated to the American public, he did it through these fireside rallies, talking very calmly, not shouting. Hitler didn't know how not to shout. Roosevelt never shouted when he held these rallies. He spoke very quietly, very personally to the American public. And he established a kind of rapport with the American public that, in spite of the fact that many Republicans were still opposed to his New Deal program, many of those same Republicans actually supported him in the elections of 1936 and 1940, and even some of them in the election of 1944 during the Second World War. And I guess I would just mention one other thing in respect to FDR in this sense. We have had elections. In 1964, in the middle of the Civil War, we had an election. Lincoln did not call off that election. In 1918, the congressional elections of 1918 were held 1 week before the war ended. In other words, Woodrow Wilson in no way tried, even though the Democrats weren't doing so well in 1918, Woodrow Wilson never considered somehow canceling the election. FDR in 1944, in the middle of the Second World War, months and months and months before the war finally ended in Europe, and a year before it finally ended in the Far East, FDR never considered canceling the election, somehow, abridging the election. And I just hope this year, in spite of COVID-19, that the President of the United States will respect our constitutional traditions and not seek to either postpone or to cancel the election.
We are down to the last 90 seconds with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Quickly, Dr. Ostrower, because we're almost out of time. What do you make of Kim Jong-un, or the lack of him in the media these days?
Well, we still don't know what's happening over there. What we do know is that he has not been seen in public for roughly a month. What we do know is that he did not show up at the main holiday, kind of national holiday celebrations, which was on April 15th. That happened to be the birthday of the man, of his grandfather, who essentially founded North Korea and became the first president of North Korea. So, why doesn't he show up? And by the way, there was a military parade shortly thereafter. He doesn't show up for that. We don't know whether he is sick. There are all kinds of rumors that he's suffering cardiac issues related to his obesity and related to his heavy smoking. By the same token, a South Korean politician, an official, said just this week that he is fine, that he is well. He may be simply, kind of hiding out, so to speak, against coronavirus, against, the possibility of contracting COVID-19. We simply don't know. But what we do know is this. If he really is sick, if he is not only sick, maybe possibly to the point where, he passes away, we are going to have one heck of a problem over there, because the Chinese have some very, very real interest in North Korea. The South Koreans obviously have it. The Americans have it. We do not want to see. The North Koreans have, we estimate, somewhere between 20 and 60 nuclear weapons. What happens to those weapons? Are they going to fall into other hands in Iran or elsewhere? This is going to be a very, very serious and potentially very unstable situation. And one has to hope, I would hope, that he really is not ill, because I just see the possibility, especially in this kind of a health crisis, I see the possibility of instability and even the possibility of war on the horizon over there.
With that, we have to leave it. Dr. Gary Ostrower, as always, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program, Brian.
California is boycotting some of the biggest car makers in the world, starting in January.